Hey everyone. Just want to quickly start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. Loving the vibe here, amazing venue. And the DJ, he's smashing it out of the park. I recognize his face from somewhere, but yeah, he's doing an awesome job. So let's talk about modernization. I just wanted to share with you some if your company's thinking about modernizing, then this talk contains some ideas I think are worth thinking about up front. From the perspective of a developer or an architect, I try to put some things in this talk that are maybe less covered in other places, so something a bit different. And really the first question is, does your company need to modernize? If you're a successful company, if you're a market leader, is it worth it? Why not keep building new features? Very often it's difficult to modernize if there's not that pressure. If you can build new features, it's very hard to say, yeah, let's stop building features and do some tech work. And even if it's difficult in your company to build new features, still, it might not be worth modernizing because the best product doesn't always win. There are other factors that make companies successful. Maybe IT is not a differentiator for your company. Maybe your company doesn't have the best product. Maybe there are other smaller startups that have a better product, but your company has a more reputable brand. Companies are already using your products, and it's just too difficult for them to switch away. And then you get whole ecosystem effects where you might use one product from a company, you use their other products, you're locked into the ecosystem, you've got all kind of training certificates and industry events that come from the company of that product. I used to work at Salesforce. They have all these training programs. You can get all these skills and badges and everything, and they have their big annual Dreamforce event. And it's like, yeah, if you switch away from Salesforce, you're switching away from all of that stuff. So you might not need to modernize. But obviously, there are lots of companies that do need to modernize, and being successful, whilst it gives you some protection, it also makes you risky. Over time, your IT systems do get stuck on old technologies. Think about companies that are starting out today. They can apply the latest tools, AI, all these cool things we're talking about, whereas companies that have been around for 10, 20 years, it's going to be very difficult to retrofit that into their existing products, for example. So there's definitely a lot of risks. I think complacency is also an interesting one. Companies think they're in the first category, we're the market leader, everyone knows us, we're the best, but actually they're in the second category, and they don't realize they're falling behind other companies. So for a lot of companies, modernization is necessary. A company that did quite well in this respect is OpenTable around 10, 15 years ago. My friend Orlando, he was working there. I know some other people that worked there. It was a very similar situation to many of us probably face at some point in our career. A big monolithic, tightly coupled code base, 100+ developers working in it. You know, it's very efficient, compile times grow and grow. Running the test takes longer and longer, deploying it. QA, merge conflicts, they were facing a lot of those problems. And at the same time, they started to notice that other companies were building features faster, and they recognized that, you know, if we don't modernize, we're probably going to lose our position as market leader. It's a very serious risk. And they were able to recognize this early. I think that's the important point, recognizing it early that there's a problem. One of the questions I often like to ask is, how long could you go without modernizing or building any new features before other companies actually overtake you as market leader? When companies say we're already in that position, that's a worrying sign because now you have to modernize, you need quick fixes, you're very reactionary. Whereas if you can look ahead and say, you know what, we've got 18 months, 2 years on the competition, we can modernize properly and not rush into bad decisions. And OpenTable did that quite well. Interestingly, OpenTable, they stopped all feature development, did this whole modernization over 8 or 9 months, like having a baby, and then went back to building new features. I don't typically recommend doing modernization that way, but in certain cases it can work. And the other thing about modernization is you might not think you need it, but at some point you probably will need it, because even if you make great decisions all through the life of your system, the assumptions you make at one point, the context those decisions are made in, might not apply in the future. So you're still going to have an architecture that isn't optimal for the business problems you're trying to solve, even if you make good decisions. And a good example of this is a company called Vinted. So as Ornella says here, they reached this situation where suddenly it was becoming very difficult to add new features. Because what happened is they built a system for one vertical, which was women's clothing. And then, as any successful company does, you grow. How do you grow? You target different customers, move into different countries. And suddenly, this system that was designed for women's clothing is now being stretched in other directions. Do you stop and refactor the whole thing? Usually companies don't do that. It's usually, we have to build the next feature, we'll make the system support this new use case. And it's probably not efficient either to continuously refactor your whole domain model. So even if you make good decisions, you're still going to have an architecture that's maybe a long way from what you would call optimal in your current business context. So I would say, if you're thinking about architecture modernization or trying to clarify what is it and why might we do it, I think it's really about being a successful company that is able to innovate at a speed of smaller, younger companies. So it's the best of both worlds. Established market leader, brand reputation, customers know and trust us, and we can innovate at speed. So in this talk, I want to cover 3 different aspects. I think the first aspect is around the concept of flow, why that should be a key part of your architecture, more on the mindset side. Then I'll talk about 5 tools I think can be very useful, ones that you're probably less likely to come across, I would say, in other talks. And then for the third part of the talk, I'll touch on the very interesting topic of, we have all these ideas, we might have this nice architecture, but how do we go on this journey? Day to day, every day, you have to put the effort in, how to keep things moving. So let's talk about flow and why that's important. I think I already touched on this, but modernization is often about being able to innovate faster. That's usually what companies are looking for. Our legacy systems are slowing us down. Maybe our systems are unreliable, production issues. We want to go faster and be competitive in the market. So if you just modernize only your tech and infrastructure, is that worth it? Does it give you any benefits? Is it enough? I would say, yes, it does give you benefits. If you're moving to the latest infrastructure and the latest programming languages and libraries, almost certainly you'll be more productive. But that's only half the story, I would say, because replacing some old legacy technologies and some old code base with a new code base that does exactly the same things, just in a new tech, well, you still really haven't fixed all of those coupling issues, and you still haven't fixed those assumptions and abstractions, like an example from Ornella. So modernization is a bit more than that if you want to actually get the full benefits of it. So I think really, as a developer or an architect, there are I'll put 4 here. Maybe there's a couple of others, maybe around data mesh, but I won't go into that now. But basically, I think the unit of architecture is the value stream. If we want to have an architecture that allows us to get new work out, build features more effectively, then we need to think, how do we design a system so that work can be done more effectively? And so that's what effectively a value stream is. It's like a pipeline of work. So how do we design a system that has these value streams where work moves quickly? So there are four key qualities here I think you need to keep in mind at all times. So the first one is thinking about your business and how you organize your business into domains and subdomains. If you want to have loose coupling, you need to identify how could we design an architecture so that the work we're doing can be done by one team or as few teams as possible to remove dependencies. So looking at your business, identifying business areas which are themselves loosely coupled. Then we have the business outcomes. If you don't have clear outcomes overall for modernization and for each value stream, it's very difficult to know, are we making the right choices? Are we optimizing for the right things? I've seen companies where the company strategy is very vague. Executives might talk about, yeah, we've always operated in this country. We might move into that country. And so the developers and architects are building this system that's super flexible, can support all possible future use cases. It just makes the system very complex for things that you probably won't need. So understanding outcomes is crucial. And the outcomes each value stream. Is it revenue, engagement, reducing costs? What are those key outcomes? And then, if you want to move quickly, teams need to be able to have ideas, make decisions, implement changes, and deploy them. So the teams, this is the social aspect that Jim was talking about. Teams need to be able to understand the bigger picture and make effective decisions in their local context. And then obviously, if you want to go quickly and develop your system faster, the software needs to be loosely coupled. It needs to be aligned to your business subdomains, and the teams need to be able to implement features and deploy them, I would say, on demand. Maybe not in every situation, but typically a team should be able to implement a feature and deploy it to production with minimal friction or blockers there. So those are the 4 key areas, I think, to keep in mind. One of the tricky things around coupling is we might think we've designed these independent code bases. We might have a bunch of different repositories, a bunch of different services. There's no API calls. There's no database integration. On a technical level, it looks like we've actually got a completely loosely coupled system. But actually, there's a concept of change coupling, where you need to build one feature, for example, you have to touch a bunch of different code bases. Even if they're not integrating, there's still bits of a feature that live in those different places. So change coupling is important. Spoke to a company a couple of years ago, and they were talking about how they have to touch 15 different microservices to implement a new kind of payment provider. That's the kind of thing we want to try and avoid here. And again, I think this goes back to the business and the business domains. If you get your business domains well, it will reduce a lot of this invisible change coupling. So a good example of a company that did this well, a company called ICE. They do royalty calculations. My friend Casper Gunya works there. So their initial architecture, you can see on the top, systems grew organically over time. There were 3 quite large systems you can see here. The teams were quite large. If you look at some of the naming, you've got the import-export system. That's a very technical name, not really coming from the business side of things. The boundaries weren't clear. There weren't well-defined business domains, so you had bigger teams that had to work on larger parts of the system and couldn't work independently on small parts and had to know how everything fits together. Deployments didn't happen very often, and the process was quite inefficient. So on the bottom, you can see that they were able to identify these subdomains. They were able to effectively align teams to subdomains, and each of those had clear outcomes. And you can see on the right-hand side some great examples here of the kind of outcomes you should be looking for, the kind of business metrics. So operationally, multiple deployments per day, that's the efficiency side of things, but reduced ingestion processing time by 80%, 5x increase in the matching process productivity. These key metrics all fit into the company's North Stars of can we calculate royalties faster, more efficiently, and pay the artists and the royalty holders who want to get their money as quickly as possible. So another key aspect here of modernization is there's probably going to be some parts of your system that aren't worth modernizing. Even if modernization is worth it, there might be things in your system that you don't need anymore. And if you just take an attitude of, we're going to rebuild the old system with feature parity, you can spend a lot of time and effort. That's just a complete waste. And if your modernization is dragging on for years and not getting finished because there's so much to do, that's the kind of thing where it gets cancelled. And I'll see this in a lot of companies, a lot of unfinished modernizations and migrations. Like, why have you got half the front end over here, half the front end over here, and all the back end in this repo? Oh, yeah, well, we started a migration 3 years ago. Leadership got bored, didn't let us finish it. What about this thing over here? Oh, yeah, that was from the migration before that one. That one never got finished either. So you really want to try and identify what really needs to be done here and reduce this problem of incomplete migrations. So I'm not sure how accurate this number is, but I think it really gives you something to think about. Pendo, based on some research they did, they think that up to 80% of the features in your system right now are being used rarely or never. So potentially, 80% of the system you're working on doesn't need to be modernized, it can be thrown away. And if you can identify that 20%, it's going to be much more effective, get finished faster, and less likely of an incomplete migration. And so it's also worth thinking about the different levels you can modernize at. As we talked about, it's not just the software and the technologies, it's also, we talked about the domain model. We built this domain model for women's clothing, now we need a model that supports different verticals as well. But it's also a chance to improve the UI. If you're going through all of this effort to modernize an old system, it makes sense to think about the UI as well. How can we improve the user journey? And very often, if you look at the user journey, you might find ways to simplify that, which can result in a simpler software. And there's also the domain itself. You can actually change how the business works, change how your users interact with your product. You can really think about the domain. And I would say on the domain model, it's also a good chance where you've got all this language in your code base that doesn't really make sense anymore. You're calling things by different names. It's a chance to actually consolidate and clarify that language. So I've got an example here when I worked with the UK government back in 2016 of this full stack kind of modernization we did. And I would just caveat here, you don't need to do this across your whole system, but it's always worth asking for each part of the system, what depth, what level of modernization is needed at each of these layers. So this government project, it was around business property taxes. Very inefficient part of the government. Every company could challenge how much tax they pay. They could take the government to court. Government didn't have enough people to do all this processing, so companies were just winning because the government didn't even turn up to these court cases based on some very old thinking. So this modernization went really from top to bottom. The user journeys were being completely revamped. We had user researchers going out every week doing user research. The tech stack was moving to event-driven microservices from some old Oracle stuff onto a platform that enabled us to spin up new microservices and deploy them in a couple of hours. Domain model changed a lot, but so did the domain itself, because we actually, on this project, we were rewriting the laws in the UK. We had the chance to say, all these government policies, we can actually change those. And this is where technology can influence the domain, because new technologies mean you can implement your business policies and processes in more effective ways. And so that's what we're doing here. So, like I said, you might not need to do this for your whole system, but I think it's always worth thinking about for each part of the system, at each of these levels, what level of modernization is going to be most effective. So those are some kind of principles and ideas, and now I'll talk about some tools you can use to approach modernization and address some of those challenges I talked about. And the first tool is listening. Very underrated skill, but more importantly, what I found really useful is kind of like a listening tour, where you go around, talk to different people in your company, just try and understand what problems are you facing, what's your big dream for the company? What have you given up asking for that would make your life amazing? And there are multiple benefits to doing this. The first one is you're shaping your modernization narrative. If you start talking about microservices and cloud, well, modernization is a technical thing. If you start asking people, what's going on in your world? How can we help you to be more effective? What challenges are you facing? Now it's a very business and organizational driven modernization, and the tech is just a solution to those problems. And the second benefit of these listening tours is you start to build trust with these people that you might not have worked with before, people on the product side, customer support, for example, because you're listening to them. And when it does come to a point further down the road where you want to say, let's stop building new features and modernize, these people will think, yeah, they came around, they listened to us, I'm going to support them in this decision, whereas otherwise it might be quite a siloed effect, and they'll say, we just want new features. And I think the other thing about this is the more you talk to different people, the more they start to see you as, yeah, this not just a tech person, but someone who can talk business and product. And you start to learn more about the business, and they start to see you, I wouldn't say as an adult, but just as more than someone who works in tech, someone who understands all aspects of the business. But asking questions is very difficult. Do you think this is a good question? And before you say this is a ridiculous question, I see things like this all the time. So I'm not surprised you're so unproductive with the in-house CRM and all of those spreadsheets. We will automate your processes and switch to Salesforce. That will be great, right? Anything else we can do to help you? So you've told someone they're unproductive. You've told someone this solution they've built out of spreadsheets is a mess when they might have put a lot of effort into making this system work against all the constraints they're facing. You've told them you're going to automate their job. You've told them what the solution is to switch to Salesforce. And you've told them how great your solution is. And then you've rubbed it in their faces by saying anything else we can do to help you, because everything I just said is not helping you. But, so it's very easy to do this. And I think the one piece of advice I would offer is to just try and not have an opinion for as long as you can. Just be good at talking to people and asking them to explain to you what's important to you, describe how you work to me. Using those kind of open questions as long as possible is very effective, I think. So talked earlier about the importance of these business outcomes, having clear North Stars. What are we optimizing for? Are we optimizing for our existing customers, or are we moving to new countries and new customer segments? Getting that clarity is crucial. So how can you do that? Very simple technique here is impact mapping, or tools like impact mapping. The importance of these tools is you can go from what is the top-level company goals for the next year or 2 years or 3 years, and you can go all the way from that to the modernization changes you want to make. So whenever anyone says to you, why are we modernizing this? You can say, well, we're modernizing this because we want to achieve this impact, which contributes to our company objective of 20 million extra revenue in that particular business area for the next year. Impact mapping is one of those tools that you can bring into your listening sessions as well. If you're talking to some stakeholder and they're throwing all this jargon at you and numbers and metrics, and you're like, this listening stuff isn't going how Nick said it would go, I'm feeling a bit stuck here, don't know what to do right now, you can just do some impact mapping and structure that conversation a bit more. Okay, so what's the ultimate objective you're trying to achieve here? The 20 million plus revenue? Or you can propose that and say, okay, so what I'm getting from this conversation is we've got to earn 20 million extra revenue in this area next year. Is that the top level objective? And you can start to structure things. The next tool is Wardley mapping. As we talked about earlier, modernization, modernizing a big old system, you don't want to spend a lot of time modernizing things that aren't as valuable and missing out on things that are super valuable. So the idea of a Wardley map is you start with your user needs and you trace that back through your system. What are the different components, what are the different parts of our architecture that fit together that enable us to provide this user need? It looks nice, but isn't this just ivory tower architecture? What's the point of all of this? The point of all of this is Wardley mapping has different stages of evolution. And based on the stage of evolution, you can make very effective modernization decisions or help to understand your business context and even help your stakeholders to clarify what they're looking for. Because one thing I learned about these listening tours is often people on the business side, they don't always have a clear vision themselves. Sometimes your job as a developer or an architect is to help them to reformulate what is it exactly you want. Let's try and make this a bit more concrete. So with a Wardley mapping, you can then say, is something Genesis? Is this a big bet we're making for the future? Is something commodity? Is this end of life? There's no more innovation happening here. You can start to have these questions about different parts of your system, and then you can decide how might we modernize. So things that are towards the left, these are big future potential. Innovating fast here is usually the goal. As you get to the right-hand side and features are becoming old and table stakes and boring, having super fast flow here and autonomous teams might not be so important. It might be, how can we reduce those costs in those areas so we can spend more time in the other stuff? I was doing some Wardley mapping recently. I did like a 4-day workshop. At the start of the workshop, we were talking about this one part of the system, this old legacy thing. The developers and architects, they wanted to modernize every aspect of this old legacy system. They had this amazing target architecture of how this new thing would work. And it was pretty cool, pretty impressive. Then we did some Wardley mapping, and we're like, wow, 90% of that legacy system is in the commodity side of things. And all this cool new AI stuff you want to do is on the left. So we had this game. I said, imagine I'm the CEO, and you have to pitch your modernization to me using this Wardley map. Suddenly, their whole perspective changed. It was like, we can't really justify modernizing that old system that much. There's a level we need to get to, but then we want to put all of our effort into the stuff on the left-hand side. Super interesting. Wardley mapping always throws up exciting insights like that. Helps people to see things differently. And the other thing about Wardley mapping is evolution happens from left to right. All of your components are evolving. You might have a new feature that's exciting, but all your competitors might catch up with you and develop the same thing, and there's no more chances to innovate on that. So evolution can happen quickly. And so what you want to think about is not where's the component now, but where will it be in 6 months, 1 year, 2 years? And that's the focus of modernization, thinking about where the company wants to be in the future and making choices that make sense for that perspective and not just how things are now. So I talked earlier about this challenge of different layers of modernization. 80% of the system might not be that useful, might not be used. How can you start working out what is needed? How can you start working out how should the product work in the future, or how could the product work, or how might we change the domain itself to make our company more valuable in some ways? And that's where event storming is one of the most useful techniques. I've been using it for years, and I highly recommend it. Definitely a skill worth learning. So with event storming, you bring a diverse group of stakeholders together. You get a nice big space. This room would be amazing for event storming. And you basically put orange Post-it notes on the wall in a timeline, mapping out parts of your business. And then you can start with the current states. People often ask, should we do the current state first or go straight to the future state? Usually I would say the current state can teach you a lot about the system that you're not aware of, and that can impact your future state thinking. So I would start with the current state, and you've got sales and marketing, all these domain experts, mapping out the current state. You can go really deep into the details where you need to, and that gives you a lot of insights about what's needed and what's not needed, and what can be improved. And then process modeling event storming is great for the future states. So you've mapped out the current state, you've identified some problems and challenges and exciting new possibilities. With process modeling, you can then say, how should our system work in the future? And as you're doing the process modeling, you're also starting to shape that domain model. You can define this model that isn't tied to women's clothing, but is a model that supports all the use cases that your system needs to support. Event storming, big picture, is all flavors really can be useful here, but it's also a great way to actually start shaping your architecture, your business domains. You've got all these domain experts in a room. You've built this timeline that combines everyone's perspective. With all of this knowledge about your business on the wall, it's the perfect opportunity to start thinking from a business perspective, what are the right boundaries here? How do we slice our business up? You just go through the timeline and start asking which groups of events feel like they're connected to each other. And you might be thinking sometimes, like, when you're working and your normal day-to-day work, and you're like, yeah, what would marketing think here? Or what would sales say here? Or what would customer support say? Well, in an event storming session, they're all there. You can just ask them, what do you call this? Is this painful to you? How might you fix and improve this? So again, you're giving those people a chance to put their ideas across and shape the narrative and the future vision. And the fifth tool, more of a concept really. There are different kinds of tools like this out there. It goes back to the point earlier of modernizing at the right level for each part of your system. So for some parts of your system, a lift and shift might be enough. Just take your current code, run it on new infrastructure. That might be the maximum in some areas. Whereas in other parts of your system, you might want to do the full reinvention I was talking about earlier, where you go through the UX, the domain model, change everything. So I think having a language and a tool that can help you to make these decisions for the different parts of your system can help you to get the best ROI for your modernization and avoid, wasting a lot of time in areas that just don't benefit from it. Here's a quick cheat sheet. So when we talk about so on here, I normally label this in two different dimensions. The one is the tech side, and the other is the actual software and its design. So on the platform modernization, the tech side, are we changing infrastructure, runtimes, languages, libraries, and frameworks? What level are we changing it? And then on the code side, are we keeping the existing code, making some tweaks, changing the domain model, or changing all of the functionality of the code as well? Like, these are the different dials we have to try and get that balance perfect. There is one other tool, and maybe a group of tools that I'm still learning a lot about. I'm not sure I'd put it on my list just yet, but I think tools like CodeScene are very interesting in helping us to visualize a system. I was currently having a conversation yesterday on the project I'm working on. Basically, last week I was working on support, so I'd get some ticket from a customer complaining about something not working correctly, and I'd have to trace it back from the UI all the way down to the database, calls between systems, and I had to go through a lot of different repositories. So I think tools that can help us visualize the system, how all these different code bases, repos fit together, and tools like CodeScene are interesting because CodeScene looks at your version control history, and it can work out who's worked on each part of the system, which parts of the system change together. But I'm not really an expert on these things, so don't take my word too much. So the final thing I want to quickly talk about is how you can get modernization started and keep your journey going effectively. It's not very easy to do. So the first thing I would say is, even though I talked about these 5 interesting and amazing tools, you don't need to do all of those things for the whole system before you can start modernizing. I actually encourage most companies try and modernize something in the first 3 to 6 months. When modernization is just ideas, people don't really get that excited. They're like, oh yeah, new CTO talking about modernizing. It will be another failed thing like the last CTO who came and left. People are already busy with their backlogs and all the stuff they're currently working on. So I think what I see is most effective is trying to deliver something as quickly as possible and show that modernization is happening, and start learning and validating ideas, having that impact as quickly as possible. Choosing the first slides can be very difficult. I wish I had more prescriptive advice here, but usually there are four kinds of choices, and I'll just quickly summarize this one. So you might feel that the first slice of modernization should always be something small and simple. Let's take our time, something that's not going to break, there's no risk, which would be the bottom left here. You're being risk averse. The problem is, 6 months down the road, people in the business start asking, why are they modernizing that thing that's no value? We could have built 20 features in the last 6 months. What's the point of this modernization? It's just a tech thing. So the other option is to go to the top right-hand corner, which is you build something that is going to add value to your product. But then what can happen is, because you're starting out with modernization, there's so many foundations, so many risks, they might start saying, or in one example I worked in, the company said, we need to have this new thing in the market in 6 months' time. And they were like, yeah, we can start modernizing there. We should be able to build it in 6 months. After 1 year, they still didn't have one line of modernized code in production due to cloud and on-prem networking issues, security issues. And so if you do go for the top right-hand corner, there's a lot of expectation to deliver something. And if it gets delayed, which is expected at the start of modernization, then that can throw the whole modernization initiative on a bad path as well. So it's very difficult here. I guess my advice is just to map out the options and try and be very clear about what the trade-offs are and what's most effective in your company. And how you shape your narrative is just as important as a decision you make. And sometimes people are asking, maybe something towards the bottom right-hand corner is, could we build something new, totally outside of the old stack, and show what's possible? That approach can also be effective, but the risk is you're not actually modernizing any of the old legacy. So it can give people an unrealistic expectation, like you built this new thing in a month, now they're going to expect you to modernize other bits in 1 month when it's going to take 6 months. And you haven't learned about if this new approach would actually work with your old legacy approach as you have this parallel migration. So what I do recommend is workshops, in-person workshops, bring people together, can have a big impact in terms of what you discover and what the value, the future state designs that come out of this, decisions you make. But these workshops can also be very effective from a mindset shift. If your company's never done event storming, if your company has a strong silos between different departments like product and tech, having these 3 to 5 day workshops in person where you do event storming, bring people together, it's another one of those wow moments. It's like, wow, it might actually be different this time. We never did this last time. Getting together, being in person, mapping out the business, working collaboratively. Yeah, this modernization is starting to interest me a bit more. So in these workshops, we call these Kickstarter workshops, and typically we go from business objectives, mapping out the current state, exploring the future state, and we try and make things actionable, so when we come away from these workshops, we've got kind of the next steps ready to go. One of the worst things that can happen is you have these amazing in-person workshops, and then nothing happens. And the next time you want to do a workshop, people are like, last workshop was great, but I didn't do anything afterwards. I'm not going to come to this one. So very beneficial, but very risky situations. Example here, company in Canada a couple of years ago, or maybe even last year. All these years, I'm getting old now. But basically, what you can see here is a perfect setup for event storming. We had this massive wall space. We mapped out, I think there's probably 10 meters. I think it was 10. I don't think we measured it. But I think it was around, maybe we did measure it, but I think it was around 10 meters. We mapped out this whole process. We got 15 plus subdomains. We had 60 people in the workshop. It's quite a large number, but it can work. And as you can see on the top of this diagram, there's some yellow strips across the top. We identified these these subdomains on the event storm. And what was great about this workshop is what you find is going to happen in most workshops. The sales team had an 80-step process that was all in spreadsheets, and there wasn't a single developer in the company who knew anything about that process. Those are the kind of things that you want to find out about before you start modernizing, and that's what happens in event storming. So workshops are important, but as I talked about, you want to keep that momentum up afterwards. How can you do that? One of the things I find most effective is the concept of an enabling team, an architecture enabling team. And basically, if you're trying to switch from building features, business as usual, working the legacy, to now we're modernizing, you're asking your organization and people to just completely think differently, not just about building new features, but refactoring the whole system. And so you need to have structure and support there to enable teams to make that transition effectively. So an architecture modernization enabling team is a team that supports other teams modernizing. Some of their work might be working with stakeholders on the business side. Some of their work might be getting into the code, working with teams. But I think one of the most crucial things about an enabling team is to have this enabling or facilitation mindset. Sometimes as an architect, you might think, I can help this team solve this problem. But if you solve that problem for them, they aren't going to be able to solve the next problem themselves either. That's what's crucial for me. It's how can I help this group get to the solution in a way that empowers them and helps them to grow. And for some architects, that's not the way they've been working before. So I think that's the key skill here. Anyways, I'm going to quickly wrap things up, and I believe it's time for lunch. So basically, as I talked about at the start, what is modernization? Successful companies build up a legacy, can become uncompetitive in their markets, and want to move faster. So modernization is basically established companies being able to modernize their systems so that enables them to work at the speed of more smaller and newer companies, or younger companies, probably say. Modernization is more than just a tech upgrade, although the tech upgrade is a key component of modernization. There's that full stack of UX, code, infrastructure, domain model, domain itself, how your business works, and also ways of working. Things like event storming and collaborative approaches might not be common in your company. Modernization is a chance to apply those ideas. Talks about these 5 interesting tools. Understand what's happening in your company, listen to people. Try and connect your modernization efforts to those big business goals. Look at your system as a portfolio and invest appropriately in each area. And use tools like event storming to map out how the system currently works to bring people together who know about different parts of the system and then shape that future state together. And finally, there's the last piece. How do you actually get modernization started to go from ideas, and then how do you keep it moving? Not this incomplete migration, the fifth one your company's had in the last 5 years, for example. So try and deliver early, get something going in 3 to 6 months, show people that things are happening, Kickstarter workshops, bring people together, map out ideas, get people excited, and then think about the structures in your organization that will support people through the transition. Maybe it's an architect's modernization enabling team, or maybe it's something else, but just remember that your company's current approach and mindset might not be effective for modernizing. You might need to have some different support and structures there and teams. And so that's basically it. You can keep in touch with me through these channels, and if you're ever in London and you want to come to the DDD London meetup or speak at the meetup, just let me know. Apart from that, thank you.
Cool. Thank you very much for your talk, Nick.
Thank you.
Are there some questions? And to ask some questions, I think we forgot somewhere the blue cube microphone. So if you have it, very nice. Thank you. It's over there. So where are we going to throw it? Over there.
Hey. I can't hear. Is the microphone turned on?
May I try again, because I think now it's on? Can you put it very close? No? But maybe we can get another microphone, just for the question. Thank you. Perfect.
Hello.
Now
Yeah.
it works.
Hey.
Hi, thanks for sharing the information. My question is, can you please elaborate what is exactly we do, like modernizing UI? Basically, for example, some company has an old app, they have like lots of problem, like design, look and feel is old, and then there are some issues which is frequently occurring. And then how they will go from the old app to new app, and what would be the best practices, if you can share quickly. Yeah.
Could you run me through that question one more time? Question about the UI, right? How
Yeah.
to modernize the UI.
Yes, yeah.
So when I worked in the government, UK government, for example, we had the user researchers going out. They were kind of starting with a blank canvas. First, understanding the challenges, and then thinking about what would be the optimal user journey if we could have a completely blank canvas. That's like on a conceptual level. Then things got a bit difficult when it's like, well, this is a nice user journey in the mock-ups, but we still have to talk to this legacy system, and we can't change the XML schema. So, for example, they wanted to reorder some of the steps in the journey. It was like a 15-step process, so quite a long process for the user, and we weren't able to change the old schema. So in that situation, we were limited by the legacy, and we wanted to add new fields and take fields away. But the legacy wasn't enabling that in the short term. So I think in terms of modernizing the UX, I would say that's where like event storming, user research, designing your UX people design this utopia vision. And then on the tech side, you're like, how much of that can we implement with the current system and the new system? And sometimes people say, let's do the UI first. Let's modernize the UI first, because then the business will see something and it's a new, improved user experience. But sometimes it's better to modernize the back end first. Because if you modernize the back end first, you can reshape those APIs, and it can enable the better UX in the long term. So I think, did that answer your question, or?
Yeah, I'm getting it. Yeah. So basically, the specific problem that you have during the time when you think the old system, you have to improve it. That's one thing, and second, the backend thing we should focus first. And the UX designer, yeah, Figma design and all this thing, if we have align with the expectation of the user, then we can make a good product. Like this is my...
Yeah, I think it starts with
yeah.
the UX team, trying to map out a vision of what would be the perfect UX if we could have it, and then starting from there, really, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Are we having some more questions somewhere? Ah, back there. Yeah, please don't throw that one.
Is it?
Yeah, so I would have a question regarding, so you mentioned that a lot of features are basically in a lot of projects are not used or rarely used. And I have seen that myself, especially in my current project. The question is, how do you argue against stakeholders that this particular feature will not make it into the new version after your modernization, because it's like so much implementation which you need to do to cover that, to enable that feature?
Yeah, very difficult. I've come up against this one a lot in my career. It's very difficult to let go of features, and I think the first step is, understanding why they think it's so valuable. I think, again, listening to them first, even if you feel like it's not useful, at least try and not have that opinion for as long as possible, so it feels like there's been some discussion phase and not jump straight into it, I would say. But sometimes the reasons can surprise you. When I worked at Salesforce, we had this amazing rules engine that would allow users to customize and set up rules for their advertising campaigns. And we said to the head of product, the VP of product in that area, like, this thing is so difficult to maintain. We get a lot of bugs in production. It's taking up a lot of our time. And almost a very small number of customers are even using this thing. And he was like, no, we can't delete it. Like, why can't we delete it? And he said, because that's one of the best tools I've got in the customer demos. They love it. When we demo the products, when the sales team demo the product, they love this rules engine thing. When they buy the product, they never even use it. So I think there's trying to get to the reason first, and then trying to have that trust relationship so they at least trust you. And then I guess it's all about, being persuasive, having a good narrative. I think trying to present it as options is something that I always do. So if we do this, it will take longer. Or what you can do, one effective I do find useful, it's an ethical question here. You can judge my character however you want to, but what I find useful is I try and push those decisions later. Yeah, we'll do that, but we'll do it later. And then hopefully they might decide we don't need that anymore, or they might leave the company, or anything could happen. So if you defer it as long as possible, it might not have to build it. No, seriously, that's...
Okay, one more question maybe? Yeah, over there. Thank you.
Hello. I would like to ask how it's possible, let's say you modernize your stack, and then after 5 years or 10 years, how you don't end up in the same position that you were before. And how it's possible, let's say, new companies that are starting up to be able to identify these issues before they reach there.
So basically, how do you get to a position where you don't need this big modernization? Is that...
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
So the question, if I understand correctly, is how can you keep a system healthy over 10 years so you don't need to modernize it, or you're not stuck on old tech?
Exactly, and how you can identify a system that you could have this issue in the future.
Good question. I think whenever you're building a new feature, I've done some other talks about this, but basically, when you're a developer and you're implementing a new feature, I think you always need to be asking yourself, and some developers have this intuition, like, how difficult was it to implement this feature, and how difficult should it have been? And sometimes you know it shouldn't have taken so long to implement that new feature. And it might be because you've worked at other companies that have a different tech stack where it's more efficient, or it might be a domain model issue, like the way we've modeled these concepts in our domain makes it very, like the example I gave earlier, we have to touch 15 microservices to implement a new payment provider. I think the key is to recognize, as we build each new feature, how much more effort is it taking than it should take? And then the discipline part is deciding at the optimal moment, let's stop and refactor what we have now and improve it now versus building new features. And the problem is, usually, unless there's enough pain to say, let's not build a new feature, building new features always wins. So I think it's very difficult. I think super difficult. I think it really comes down to discipline, to recognize that things are taking longer than they should. Let's actually stop and invest time now. One of the examples in my book, a company called mobile.d, they introduced this concept in their company called cost of change. And they said, every time we build a new feature, cost of change goes up. The next feature becomes more expensive. And this was a concept they used throughout the whole business, so that everybody knew whenever we build a new feature, the next one is going to take longer because the system has a higher cost of change. And so because that became a concept in their company, they were then able to establish a certain amount of time for actually reducing the cost of change. And I think cost of change is a concept that's maybe a bit more useful than technical debt. Technical debt is kind of like, a techie word, whereas cost of change is more business focused. So yeah, I think having good narrative like that can help as well.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, we can take one more, and then we are going to lunch break.
He's saying no.
He says no? Okay, then Nick, you're here in the afternoon.
There goes my ethics again.
But you're here in the afternoon as well.
Yeah,
right?
you can come up and ask me if you want.
Then let's do it that way, yeah? Okay, perfect. Then give it up once more for Nick Tune. Thank you.